All right, we will go ahead. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Saeed. I'm the co-founder of Arab Youth Climate Movement Qatar. I'm very delighted that you're all here. If you're based in Doha, I know how difficult and challenging it is, and how tempting is it to go out and take a stroll in this lovely weather. But you're still here, and we really admire your commitment. And I'm really grateful for your time, and I'm also very grateful for all of the participants from across the world as well, who are interested in this topic. And just a bit about our organization. Arab Youth Climate Movement Qatar, or AYCM Qatar, is a non-profit independent grassroots organization based in Qatar. We are a registered organization. Our sole purpose is to shift the environmental discourse in the country, and where we try our best, to bring more informed discussions on environmental issues, and push for policy and push for policy change, and build capacity of local community for both young people as well as for adults. And we do this with three different initiatives, like with grassroots education and awareness, capacity building and community development, and third, policy and advocacy. And Earth Talk series is one of the key and strategic initiatives of Arab Youth Climate Movement Qatar. And today's talk is part of this series, where we invite leading environmentalists, UN diplomats, activists, practitioners from around the world to Qatar. But unfortunately, because of COVID, we couldn't able to bring them here. So we are doing it online to talk about on very diverse environmental issues that we are confronting today, and how we could resolve them, by bringing debate into our daily lives. And for today's topic, so we have environmental cost of war, where we are very much familiar about the war, where humanitarian catastrophe and economic and social crisis are byproducts of war and armed conflict. Though it's been documented heavily, and the images of horrors of bombs and military weapons have always moved us. But the other side of the war and armed conflict that is often ignored and overlooked is the environmental impact. At times, we have seen the direct impact of usage of chemicals such as chlorine and sarin gas and depleted uranium bullets. Along with these direct impacts, we have seen indirect impacts such as hazardous toxic chemicals from military waste, heavy metal discharges, fuel hydrocarbons, radioactive materials, and unexploded ordnance waste, endocrine disrupting chemicals, and many others, which have kind of long-term impact on the civilian health and well-being, even after the war is over, and even the militaries, that have left this place, but their footprint lasts really long time. And across the world, the lack of accountability for the harm to the environment and public health caused by conflict and military activities undermines global efforts to help fragile countries recover from armed conflicts. And lack of accountability always weakens the environmental and health rights of citizens. It damages peace building and reconciliation initiatives, impedes the implementation of global health policies, leads to loss of ecosystems and biodiversity, and weakens democracy, justice, human rights, and international security. And to shed light on this topic that has been often ignored, and we have an organization and we have experts from here, who talk about this one. And we are very delighted to have Doug Weir. And Doug has undertaken research and advocacy on the polluting legacy of armed conflicts and military activities since 2005. And a former coordinator of the International Coalition to Ban Uranium Weapons, he later expanded his work to encompass conflict pollution and the toxic remnants of war. Before establishing the Conflict and Environment Observatory to monitor and raise awareness of the environmental and derived humanitarian consequences conflicts. Doug has contributed to a wide range of domestic, regional, and international initiatives on conflict and environment, with a current focus on the work of UN Environment Assembly and on the progressive development of the legal framework protecting the environment in relation to armed conflicts. He holds degrees in geology and print journalism from Manchester and Sheffield universities, and a visiting research fellow at King's College London in the Department of Geography. And during COP26, the Conflict and Environmental Observatory and its academic partners, Concrete Impacts, launched military emissions, an online platform dedicated to improve the transparency and accessibility of military emissions data reported to UNFCCC. Doug, you go ahead. Thank you so very much. We're really delighted that you are here, and we really appreciate your time and all the work you do, and we salute your work. And I know how sensitive and how difficult it is to do this one, and the challenges and the wrath that you bring from big military states. And we really appreciate the work that you do. Thank you so very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Saeed. That was quite an introduction. And yeah, I suppose it's we wouldn't be incurring their wrath if we weren't doing our job properly. Yeah, so tonight I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the work we do and some of the issues which we see in conflicts, and then some of the wider sort of context around them. So I shall just share my screen as I have a few slides. Okay, how's that looking? Good stuff. Okay, so just very briefly about our organisation. We're a UK charity, and the focus of our work is research and advocacy on the environmental dimensions of armed conflicts and military activities. And kind of the key stuff we do is research itself, so tracking environmental issues and trends in conflict areas or where military activities are taking place, and also trying to communicate that to a whole wide range of stakeholders, from the public to policymakers, and then also feeding that knowledge and data into our advocacy work within kind of the UN system and the different processes which are ongoing at the moment. So just want to talk, this is kind of the structure. So I'm going to talk a little bit in general terms about how wars impact the environment, and look at some contemporary cases of damage that we've tracked and monitored, and then talk a little bit about preventing harm, and so what kind of processes are ongoing at the moment to try and reduce the environmental impact of conflict, and then just have a quick look ahead. So yeah, and along the way there'll be some kind of key bits to understand, like armed conflict being sustainable development in reverse, which is yeah, understandable, I think, when you certainly look around the region. So initially, we'll look at how wars impact the environment. So this is a key thing, and this is one of the reasons why we established the Observatory, that the environment has been this kind of silent casualty, but it obviously, sides suggest the introduction, you know, we look at the appalling humanitarian impact of conflict, and obviously that has been people's chief focus and primary focus, and that's completely understandable. And historically, there's also been a lot of difficulty with getting environmental data out of areas affected by conflict. And so if you haven't got the data and you haven't got the focus, it's really difficult to try and make the case for enhanced protection, because you need to kind of understand the problem that you're seeing. This is changing, and I'll just talk a little bit about how this is changing as we go along. So this is quite a complicated slide, I grant you, but I just wanted to situate what we're going to talk about here and communicate this kind of idea that the environment isn't just a thing which is damaged in conflict. So if we look at the center of the graph, that's kind of the during conflict period, which is what we're going to be looking at. But we need to see the environment, peace and security as kind of this continuum. So the environment can be a driver of conflict. It can kind of fuel grievances over water or access to fossil fuels. And then post-conflict, it can actually be a tool for building peace, but it can also be a tool for spoiling peace as well. And so when we approach conflict in the environment, we can't just look at damage caused during war, and certainly damage caused just by the fighting of war. It's much broader than that. And the environment is there before the conflict. It's obviously there after the conflict, hopefully. And so we need to understand it throughout the whole conflict cycle and the pressures on it and the way that it influences society's changes, depending on where you are in this kind of cycle. So there's kind of 6 key ways that the environment is damaged in conflict. This first one here, this is the Pančevo chemical works in former Yugoslavia, which was bombed twice by NATO. There wasn't really a sound military reason for them to do so. It wasn't contributing significantly to the war effort. It was part of NATO's efforts to destabilize the regime by knocking out the infrastructure of Yugoslavia. And this caused a huge amount of chemical pollution. Like 8 tons of liquid mercury spilt, stuff went into the Danube and then caused transboundary pollution for neighboring countries. It was pretty grim as an incident. The second way we can kind of look at this is the legacy of weapons and munitions. So not just kind of like the chemical weapons or nuclear weapons testing, which obviously takes place outside conflict, but just conventional weapons. So landmines, artillery shells, rockets, all the explosives that tend to be used are toxic to some degree. They may pretty much all contain heavy metals. And then obviously what the weapons actually do to buildings or to the environment can cause lasting damage. And I mean, clearly, stuff like minefields, they can stay in place for decades after the conflict and very much influence how people can use and interact with the environment. The third way is kind of human displacement. So this is one of those ways in which conflicts can cause transboundary environmental impacts. So if you look at the Middle East region, displacement from Syria, and this is the Zatari refugee camp in Jordan, which was established to house Syrian refugees, currently has around 80,000 inhabitants in it. So this huge shift of people over the border to Jordan, but also to Lebanon, to Turkey, this carries kind of an environmental impact in terms of the resources which people need. And if you don't manage that, whether it's in a camp setting like this, or when people are sort of just living in cities and mixing in with the urban population, then that can cause grievances, particularly somewhere like Jordan or the wider region where you have water insecure communities. Similarly, if you look at the impact of internal displacement, that's probably more of almost what you see, then shifts within countries during conflicts can also sort of lead to these impacts. Increasingly, this is being recognized, and many humanitarian organizations begin to look at managing the environmental impact of displacement to help protect the health of the inhabitants, but also to address these wider issues of grievances with a local community. The next way is kind of how extractive industries are used to fund and to fuel conflict. So this is DRC, this is a coltan mine. This has a massive environmental impact on the communities around here, on the workers, and on the environment more generally. A lot of time this is to provide the kind of products which we use in our phones, like coltan or cobalt increasingly, which is going to be very necessary. You've got to find the transition to greener technologies. So we see this as a pretty common situation. It's not just metals, it's obviously hydrocarbons, which can be a cause for conflict. And the next way is how the use of explosive weapons in particular, but conflict generally can cause the loss or disruption of water, sanitation and waste infrastructure. This was a water tower in Gaza, which was bombed by Israel. So you're not just talking about people not having access to water, but also in the case of sewage plants, for example, you can see significant contamination of the environment, whether it's the marine environment through solid waste and sewage being dumped into the sea, or contamination of soils and groundwaters around these sites. Finally, we've got this how the environment is actively used as a weapon of war. So this is a photo from Qayyara in northern Iraq, where Islamic State set fire to about 30 oil wells as essentially a terror weapon. This caused a huge amount of local pollution, affected around 240 square kilometers, with pollution of the air, but also of the land. Pipelines were also opened as well. And this is something we see historically quite a few times in conflicts as we look at them. So there's kind of the main types of harm that we see. So now I'll just look at a few contemporary cases just to illustrate this point. So I'm going to start with Ukraine. There's quite a lot to look at these slides, but these are mostly just here to get across the message that where you fight has a really big influence on the environmental impact of the conflict. So Eastern Ukraine as Donbass region, which is where the conflict has been between the Russian-backed separatists and the Ukrainian state. It's home to a lot of coal mining and heavy industry. So it's got this 200-year history of coal mining, and it's where people have just built all their industrial factories and chemical works, because that was where the main suppliers and products were. It's a terrible place, a really bad place to have a conflict, that you have all these hazardous industrial sites and in the middle, people firing explosive weapons at each other. So it kind of reiterates that it's not just how you fight, but it's also where you fight, which can have this real strong influence on the environment. And this has kind of reached the stage where both sides of the conflict, both parties to the conflict, are aware of some of these risks. But we've also seen some of these really hazardous sites being used almost as human shields or environmental shields, with people placing their troops in the proximity to them, knowing that the other side won't fire shells at them for fear of releasing these really dangerous chemicals. From Ukraine, we'll go to Syria, and I include this. So this is satellite imagery just from Google Earth of some of the areas of Syria where we've seen artisanal oil refining set up. And this is kind of an interesting example of how one environmentally damaging practice in conflicts can lead to another environmentally damaging practice. So in Syria, in the areas under Islamic State control, Russia, NATO, they wanted to knock out Islamic State's oil production capacity because Islamic State were making money from it. And so they went and bombed much of Syria's oil infrastructure. Obviously, the people living there, they still need fuel for heating, for driving. And so they started gathering their own or new industries, localized industries set up to gather the crude oil and then to refine it themselves. And they do so with these open air artisanal refineries. Often it was kids who were operating them, and there's stuff. So when you look down from space, you can see, if you do like a time sequence on Google Earth, you can see how these sort of clusters of refineries spread, and in the process, it pollutes the air, it pollutes the ground. And this was all a result of, major militaries blowing up oil infrastructure, causing its own environmental damage, which then leads to these reverberating knock-on effects further down the conflict of supporting and encouraging this artisanal oil refining system. From Syria, go to Libya, which again, we can kind of be typified of looking at oil and water. So on the left here, you have the Essida oil refinery storage facility just near Ras Lanuf on the coast. And this was damaged during fighting between armed groups, causing this huge fire. This top one is an image from NASA, where you can very much see this from space. And when it zooms out, you can see it spread hundreds of kilometers, this plume from the site. And obviously the oil was a key factor and remains a key factor in the dynamics of the conflict itself, so control over the oil resource. Over on the other side, this is water. So this is from a small town called Sabah in central Libya. And this is an example of how conflict impacts water resources, not just through direct damage, but through the professionals and experts who do the upkeep and maintenance of water supplies. They might flee. Spare parts are difficult to get hold of. People can't do repairs that are necessary. And over the course of many years, you can watch this sewage treatment plant in the center of Sabah overflow on a regular basis and spill brown water sewage into the town center. But because this is quite an insecure location in central Libya, this stuff just wasn't being dealt with or repaired. From Libya, we'll go to Iraq, and this is another example from Islamic State's use of the environment as a weapon of war. So these are these oil fields around Kayara, which you talked about before, but then this white smoke is from a sulfur plant called Al Mishraq. So the oil in northern Iraq is very rich in sulfur. During the oil processing, they remove the sulfur, and there are these huge stockpiles of solid sulfur just sitting on at this facility. And in repeated conflicts, it's been set alight. And the amount of sulfur that's stored here. So going back to 1991, there was the eruption of Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines, and it put out a lot of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere and led to the Earth cooling for by about 1.5 degrees over the next couple of years. The amount of sulfur which is stored at Al Mishraq could do a similar thing if it all went up in flames. When it's burning, creates sulfur dioxide, which then reacts and forms sulfuric acid in people's lungs when they breathe it in. So this incident hospitalized around 1,000 people. But again, it's this issue of the environment and industrial sites being actively used, actively weaponized during conflicts. Then on to Afghanistan. Again, it's a busy slide, but my point here is that so Afghanistan has faced 3.5, 4 decades of conflict, and that has a huge impact on environmental governance. Took until around 2008 with the support of international community for Afghanistan to set up its own environmental protection agency. But in the process, you have these environmental governance issues, which means that for Kabul in particular, there's still a lot of plastic being burnt. There's still a lot of very dirty fuel being burnt. Kabul sits in this bowl, and particularly during the winter, you get these temperature inversions, which locks all the pollution down into the bottom of the valley. So we got this data from the US Embassy, which is freely available on this website, and then processed it to see what state the air was. And it's a shockingly poor state. But Afghanistan has very little capacity to actively address this because of the years of conflict have impacted and impeded environmental governance. Moving from Afghanistan to Nagorno-Karabakh and the recent conflict last year between Azerbaijan and Armenia. What's interesting here, so there's kind of two issues. So one was every conflict kind of has its own fingerprint almost of environmental damage. And in the case of Azerbaijan and Armenia, both sides were using incendiary weapons, so white phosphorus, firing them at each other, and an area which is very heavily wooded. And there was a huge response on social media. So we could use different tools to look at how many fires there were. And that's this graph at the bottom, which shows during this period, you can see like this far higher level of fires than would otherwise be expected. We can look at where they take place and how intense they are. But what was very interesting about this conflict in particular was the extent to which the environment was used and sort of propaganda on social media. So there was a parallel conflict on social media between those backing Armenia and those backing Azerbaijan. In the case of Armenia, it tended to be Armenian environmental NGOs and also the Armenian diaspora all the way around the world who were promoting these tweets, allegations of incendiary weapons use, of ecocide. On the Azerbaijani side, it was the Ministry of Environment and other government ministries who were pushing and responsible for these tweets. But it was interesting to see the extent to which the environment was of such a high profile in this conflict on social media, and was being kind of, environmental information was being actively weaponized. So it's not just weaponizing the environment, but also environmental information in the context of a conflict being used as a weapon. I'm just going to talk a little bit about Yemen, just because we've done quite a lot of research on Yemen, and there's some good examples. So if you follow the conflict in Yemen, you might be familiar with this story, which we broke and first published back in 2018. And this is this Safa oil tanker. So this isn't an oil tanker which moves around, it's moored permanently in position. It was built in 1976 and it's got over 1 million barrels of oil in it. Since 2015, there's been no upkeep of the tanker because of the conflict. And this tanker now poses this really serious risk of a huge catastrophic fire or catastrophic spill because it's a large metal object sitting on a very salty, warm ocean. In addition, you see it's the map on the top right-hand side. It's quite close to Al Hodeida, which is the main sort of route for humanitarian aid into Yemen. So if there was a huge spill, it would shut down the port potentially for several months. It's also very close to Cameron Island, which is one of the very few potential marine protected areas off the coast of Yemen. And so the spill would be catastrophic for this area, but also for the wider Red Sea. So it would have environmental, ecological impacts, but also potentially very serious humanitarian impacts for the Yemeni people. This issue, the sort of more profile it's received, the more it has become politicized. So essentially, the Houthis are currently obstructing the UN's access to this vessel to see what condition it's in. And this dispute has been now ongoing for months and has been escalated up to the UN Security Council. Another issue which we often see in conflict is impacts on agriculture and food security. And so we looked at all the agricultural areas in Yemen and looked to see what condition they were in and how they've been impacted. And these different areas, it's quite a complicated story about why. So there are some areas like this southern Tehama on the left down here where there's been active fighting, and that's caused a lot of farmers to actually stop operation because it's just been too insecure and unsafe. There are other areas where people can't get hold of diesel or water or other agricultural inputs. There's not been a response that's been needed for crop pests like locusts. And in the case of Yemen, we were seeing locust swarms emerging in Yemen and then spreading southwards down the east side of Africa. And so this was another of these transboundary environmental impacts where normally the UN Food and Agriculture Organization would have been out spraying early locust swarms in Yemen, but because of the conflicts, they can't get access. And so these locusts then are able to grow and spread down to affect East Africa. Another issue for, which was quite an interesting story to kind of unpick, was we used NASA's GRACE mission, and these are satellites which they put up in space, which measure gravity. And in the case of Yemen, where there's no surface water, where there's no ice caps, you can use these to measure groundwater levels. And so we tracked fluctuations in Yemen's groundwater and found that since 2017, 2018, there's been this big decline in groundwater, whilst at the same time, this is the blue line, you can see that rainfall is increasing. So we would expect to see groundwater to come up. And at the same time, agriculture, as we've just seen, has been impacted. So there's not as much agricultural use of water in Yemen. But what we actually found when we looked was that there's been this, we think there's been this huge explosion in solar power. So you can see this from space in these agricultural areas and see all these solar arrays popping up on farms. And historically, the Yemenis use diesel, and they use diesel pumps to pump up groundwater to then irrigate their agricultural areas. With the conflict, diesel has become very difficult to get hold of and more expensive. And so there's been this very rapid transition to solar, both for people's houses and homes, but also for agriculture. And when you've got solar, you don't have any limits on how much water you can pump, or you have fewer limits because you're not reliant on the cost of diesel. And so we think what we've seen is this, what would be an environmentally friendly or sustainable response to the lack of fuel, potentially then fueling this unsustainable groundwater abstraction. And for Yemen, before the conflict, around 2,500 people were killed every year in disputes over access to water. And so if you can't actually manage groundwater in Yemen in a sustainable way, then it's very hard to see how you can build a sustainable peace in Yemen, because there will be conflict, future conflict over access to water. And then finally, I think just, very quick look at biodiversity. So this is another area we see where wars can impact biodiversity, wildlife, natural areas. And this is very common in most conflicts we see. There are some cases where, because of the conflict, people can't use areas in the way that they did before, and that can sometimes have benefits for biodiversity. But in most cases, what we see is that this collapse of environmental governance can have a really severe impact on protected areas and nature reserves and things like that. So we looked at some of the protected areas in Yemen to see what state they were in from the conflict. And you can see the map on the left, there are quite a few different areas. So going down bottom left, the Socotra archipelago, which is very much out of the way of the main fighting, but has still been impacted by the conflict. And that's broadly been about this collapse of environmental governance. And it's meant that international conservation programs and funding haven't been able to work in the way they were working before. And there's also issues around marine and coastal governance. And we looked at a number of issues, but one of them was whether illegal fishing was taking place in what's supposed to be a marine protected area. And we could tell from vessels transponders that this was certainly the case. And we had these incursions from different countries, fleets who were fishing off the island. Another one is these relict tropical bits of forest, and these used to be much more common across the region when the climate was wetter, and now they're just restricted to a few valleys in Yemen, and they're quite special and quite rare ecosystems. But what we've seen is that there have been increased levels of deforestation in many of them, and that's again linked to this access of diesel and gas for cooking in Yemen. And so people have resorted to firewood, and deforestation and wood cutting has increased, and that's then having an impact on these quite sensitive areas. And then finally down at the bottom, this was one of Yemen's few protected areas, and it was this project in Aden to create this green space, this bird reserve for migratory birds on a former landfill site. And over the course of the conflict, you can see how this site, which once won a prize from the UN Development Programme, one of its Equator Prizes for this brilliant sustainable livelihoods project, how this thing has fallen into kind of disrepair, that the infrastructure that was built there has been damaged. new material is being dumped at the landfill, probably demolition waste from bombing in Aden. And so you've seen this sort of slow decline and collapse of governance and environmental protection. Okay. So what can be done to stop it? So I think the main thing for us has been to be able to document it. And if you can't document it, then there's no way you can make the case or the argument that these things should be protected. So over the course of those examples, I've talked about a few different methodologies which we've used, whether it's gravity, whether it's looking at social media, looking at increasing access to satellite imagery. We can get through simply things like Google Earth and time hop, so you can look at changes over time, to some of the more costly products for satellite remote sensing. And then things looking at stuff like vegetation health and quality. So there's amazing tools which we can use. Most of them are open source, which we deploy, but it's incredible compared to just 10 years ago of what we can do and how much we can monitor, sometimes in almost real time. And that's having a significant impact on the arguments and advocacy that we do. So there are laws that are supposed to protect the environment in conflicts. As you can imagine, or as we've seen, they're not particularly effective, and that's been a significant part of the problem, to the extent that the laws protecting anything during conflict are effective, but the environment has really struggled. So protection of the environment in conflicts first kind of emerged in the 1970s, and that was in response to the Vietnam War. And that coincided with the time of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, writing about sort of pollution and chemicals, and also about sort of the wider birth of the environmental movement internationally. And then in Vietnam, you had the use of Agent Orange herbicides, you had mechanical destruction of rainforests. You had these really hideous conflict, where the environmental impacts were very clear. It was mechanized, industrial, scientific destruction of the environment. And at the same time, you had these kind of concerns around how else could we as humans impact the environment. And this led to the addition of the environment to international humanitarian law, and that was through the additional protocols of the Geneva Convention. So additional protocol 1, which contains some provisions for environmental protection, which are extremely weak, but it was a start. And also to the NMOD Convention, which was trying to regulate the use of earthquakes or tsunamis, which might be deliberately caused, it's all quite sci-fi, to damage the environment. A little bit later on, we had 1991 Gulf War and huge oil well fires, and that led to this kind of political response, UN General Assembly, but also the Red Cross, who tried to develop some new guidelines, environmental guidelines for militaries to use. They didn't go down particularly well at the time. A little bit later on, so in 1999, UN Environment Programme, we're kind of tasked initially with looking at the environmental impact of the conflict in Yugoslavia, and this led to them developing this model of post-conflict environmental assessments, where they would, at the request of an affected state, go in and look at what's been damaged and issue a report on it. And this process really helped us learn more about how the environment is damaged. And if you look at the kind of debates in the United Nations Security Council over this time, you can see issues around natural resources in particular, like blood diamonds or coltan or cobalt, stuff we see in the DRC at the moment, kind of emerging into the discourse that natural resources as its driver of conflict were becoming sort of more common and more visible. This knowledge that UNEP was developing, it kind of contributed in 2009 to this report, which I'll touch on in a minute, which has kind of set up the last 10 years where we've seen this acceleration of processes to address environmental issues and conflicts. So we've been living through quite a significant time for this framework and the very rapid development of it. I'll just talk a little bit about that now. So this report back in 2009, which led to PERAC, as we call it, which stands for the Protection of the Environment in Relation to Armed Conflicts. And this is a report that UNEP put together with the Red Cross and the US Environmental Law Institute. And so historically, going back to the previous slide, from kind of the 70s up to the noughties, all we'd had really was international humanitarian law. And it's very weak and permissive protection for the environment, and that really only applies during conflicts. Doesn't apply before or after. And as we saw at the start, that the environment needs to be viewed as this continuum. It's not just how we protect it in conflict, which matters. And so they argued in this report that you could look to other sources of law. So environmental law, which doesn't necessarily stop during a conflict, similarly human rights law, international security law and criminal law. You didn't have to rely just on these really weak provisions of international humanitarian law. You could bring together and merge different sort of principles and components and then create a better shield of protection for the environment. And one of the outcomes from this report was they recommended to the UN International Law Commission, which is a body which the UN tasks with the progressive development and codification of international law. And they suggested to them that, look, you know, there's potential here, you should pick up this topic, study it, and then issue recommendations. And that's duly what happened in 2011. And in addition, at the same time, the Red Cross, who had tried to develop their military guidelines in the wake of the 1991 Gulf War, they've also initiated a process to kind of update that. And that looks at written law, but also customary law, and how things have changed and how interpretations have changed. So the thing about the environment is that the more, it's not a static concept. The more we understand, the more we know about it, the more we can do to protect it. And so this kind of reflects the fact that environmental understanding has moved on significantly, and that needs to be reflected in the law. It's international humanitarian law, so it's quite conservative. They're super constrained by governments who don't necessarily want progressive change in this area. But yeah, last year they updated and published their new guidelines. In addition, previous year, another very busy slide, I apologize. The International Law Commission published 28 draft principles to protect the environment in relation to armed conflicts. So it's not just during, it's in relation to, and that was very specifically chosen. So this is in dark green, the principles that apply during armed conflict. And these are mostly based on existing international humanitarian law, stuff the Red Cross had also been working on. Principles that you can apply in situations of occupation, like in Palestine. And this is a really interesting area because the law in this field hasn't really moved on very much since like the early 20th century. And to then all of a sudden have some new law which kind of integrated issues around environmental human rights and sustainable use of natural resources in an area under occupation. It's quite an interesting, exciting area. And then we've got the bright green. There was the stuff, what do you do after conflicts? What do you do to clean up? What do you do to gather information? What do you do to assist affected communities? How do you deal with the stuff that's left over, the remnants of war, whether they're on land or at sea? And then in addition, kind of a suite of general principles which apply throughout or can be applied throughout these different stages of the conflict. So stuff around peace operations, UN peace operations should address the environment. How do you protect the land of indigenous peoples? And then in addition, what do you do about corporations who might be causing environmental damage in their areas of operation? 5-minute warning, right. Nearly finished, you'll be pleased to hear. In addition to these kind of legal processes, there's also been UN processes, so resolutions of the UN Environment Assembly. We've seen all these debates in the UN Security Council, so this issue of the FSO Safa oil tanker, for example, which has been there for the last couple of years. But one of the issues there is that, you know, there's not hard security responses to these environmental issues. You can't really go in and shoot these issues. You need to deal with the root causes of them. Elsewhere in the Human Rights Council, we've seen conflict and military pollution raised as an issue. And then in the UNFCCC on climate change, there's increasing debate around climate and security and also military emissions, which we've been doing some work on. And this was why we were at Glasgow recently, and this is looking at the contribution that militaries make to climate change. And historically, military emissions have been exempted from climate agreements at the behest of the United States. And so we tried to bring together all the data that's currently there on what countries currently report, and found that only 5 countries do the bare minimum of reporting their emissions. And then there are countries like Saudi Arabia, China, India, who spend vast amounts on military equipment every year, who don't report any data or disaggregated data on their emissions. So this is a huge black hole, and it could be 2.5 to 4 or 5% of global emissions from every source which may be linked to militaries, and yet which are just absent from the UNFCCC reporting. So very briefly, just to sum up, yeah, so the key thing for us, I think, is it builds on this issue of the environment as a silent victim and how we need to mainstream the environment, peace and security together. So there are different ways and different steps you can take to make sure the environment kind of gets foregrounded a bit more, because if it doesn't, then no one's going to take the political action to actually protect it. So one of the things is to look at just get this recognition of this relationship between the environment, peace and security across this whole conflict cycle. And then we also need to make this link around how protecting the environment protects people, or protects civilians in the case of conflict. We need to develop and complete the work on this legal framework and make sure that it's complied with and that there's accountability, which is a huge challenge in the context of armed conflicts. And then in addition, we need to talk about the environment, peace and security, and we need to do that in security processes at the UN and elsewhere, but we also need to do it in environmental processes like the UNFCCC, like the debates around biodiversity and the post-2020 biodiversity framework. We need to make sure there's conflict stuff in the environmental and environmental stuff in the security and conflict discourse. As we've seen, data and monitoring is really vital to this, and that's making sure there's enough support for the data architecture we need to actually track these issues, because without that we can't really make good decisions around how to respond to them. Excuse me. And then finally, we need to do better, do more to engage with the affected communities on the ground. A lot of this stuff historically has been very top down. If the UN might say something about it, but we need to work more with civil society and environmental organizations on the ground in these conflict areas, because they continue their work even in insecure and conflict affected settings, and we need to help support them and work with them to document these issues. And that's me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doug. A really, really interesting presentation. Thank you so very much. If you have any questions, you can raise your hand, and so we can have a quick Q&A. And until then, like, I just wanted to ask, like, in terms of, like, I know like many UN Security Council regulations are easily flouted, like, in international, when it comes to international conflict, especially when you have this major big powers involved. How do you kind of hold them accountable, like, when this idea of ecocide happens, like, when there was more deliberate attempt to destroy crops or, like, pollute and with toxic pollution, what kind of, have you any success stories about, like, making them accountable for cleaning up after they left the country or anything?
It's a really difficult area. So I guess there's a few examples, none of which are entirely satisfactory. So you could look at after the 1991 Gulf War, the UN Security Council set up the UN Compensation Commission, where Iraq was forced to pay reparations to neighboring countries for the damage caused, and a subset of that was for environmental damage linked to these oil well fires. But at the same time, that was, victor's justice. It could only be done because a lot of Iraq's money was offshore and could be used in this way. But then we can look at somewhere like in 2006, Israel bombed a power station, power station in Lebanon, causing a huge oil spill, 15,000 tons of heavy fuel oil spread down the coast, causing oil slicks. Israel have never sort of accepted responsibility for that. And there's been UN General Assembly resolutions that Lebanon have submitted every year since, and just denials and no response from Israel. And then similarly, even when it's caused by non-state armed groups, so Islamic State causing all these oil well fires. And but when we look at Iraq and look at how they're dealing, how justice is being served, as far as they're concerned, if they capture someone and they're a member of Islamic State, then that's the death sentence, death penalty for them. And you never even get to the point of discussion about, did you cause this environmental disaster? Because it's just like, well, and no one's really looking at that. So on all these levels, whether it's caused by states or non-state armed groups, we don't really have the mechanisms in place currently to actually deal with accountability for damage in a meaningful way.
So at the end of the day, the civilians was just going to be like, the receiving end of the conflict, and as well as the post-conflict as well. I wonder, like, because some countries are much more active, like in terms of providing aids, like, in the post conflict times, like in terms of providing support like, economic economic recovery and peace building options. But do you see that, like, has there been a new effort or renewed effort to restore ecosystems? And that's something like why I asked is, like, in Qatar, one of the reports that I worked initially has just been pushing for restoring environmental ecosystems, particularly in conflict-ridden countries, because like that's sometimes like the source of conflict and trigger resource scarcities, trigger conflicts, and like how Qatar could shift its aid predominantly to restore ecosystems. So do you see that, like, there is a kind of a global change or acceptance to restore ecosystems, to put back and, like, get back the community's livelihood?
There is a change happening. I think it still remains a very, very small part of overall funding, but I think particularly donors are increasingly wanting to see fund projects which cause a range of goods or provide a range of goods and aren't just simply focused on one thing. So, for example, a good example is we do work with the humanitarian mine action community, looking at how you can reduce the environmental impact of clearing landmines and other explosive remnants of war. And one of the things they do is they clear a lot of landmines, and there's a question of what do you then do with that land afterwards, and are there projects that you can do which would provide climate adaptation mitigation benefits, which would lead to biodiversity gain? How could you work with local environmental NGOs in those areas to help support them capacity building and around stewardship and sustainability and environmental information? And for donors, that means you're not just clearing landmines, you're also providing climate biodiversity benefits and building civil society. So there's the potential for a lot of projects like this around sort of environmental peace building. There's this wider sort of bracket for it. And donors are just beginning to kind of start thinking about that, both sort of foundation and institutional donors, but also government donors as well. But there's a very long way to go, I think. But yeah, there's so many really good ideas for how this work could be sort of taken forward, and a real sort of need and urgency, because as we've seen, it's not something you can get compensation for or accountability for from states. So it's going to have to come through the kind of humanitarian donor community and environmental donor community to implement these projects and design them.
Okay, interesting. If you have any questions, please raise your hand, or you can just post it on the chat box. I have one question particularly about the military emissions. Again, like, it's always, military is always considered as a national security, and like no one are allowed to question, like, it's a very sensitive subject. I mean, like in any countries, especially like the country where I come from in India, like you are not allowed to question or criticize the military for all its humanitarian activities. And also, like, if you ask any further data, you won't get it either. But how, where do you see in terms of the way forwards, like, with the climate changes becoming far more relevant, and like, there's increasing pledges, again, it's just pledges and commitments. How do you see this military institutions are going to step up, like in terms of reporting all of these things? Are you optimistic about it? Yeah.
A few people have asked me that question about optimism over the last few months. In some ways I am a bit optimistic, right? So I've been working in this space for quite a long time, and over the last 18 months, we've gone from kind of almost no discussion around military emissions to the Secretary General of NATO saying, he went to COP this year, he was in Glasgow for the first time, and he quite happily acknowledged that we're not going to deal with climate change unless we deal with military emissions as well. Mm-hmm. And that was Secretary General of NATO saying that, who admittedly former Norwegian environment minister and stuff, but still is a kind of a NATO position. And from here in the UK, it's, we're in this sort of strange situation where the UK Ministry of Defence is actually globally one of the leaders on this issue. So we have passed net zero legislation for 2050, which means the government needs to get to net zero by 2050. The Ministry of Defence is responsible. It's the single biggest institutional emitter within government. So it emits more than 50% of the entire government's emissions. So the Ministry of Defence is legally bound to have to contribute to this goal of net zero. And the military, they got a guy to undertake a study, and they put out a big sustainability report, and it was kind of talking about all the right things. We've had the Royal Air Force here, who fly jets for a living, saying, well, we're going to beat 2050, we're going to be net zero by 2040. And it's like, you're literally an Air Force flying jets around all the time, and it's not quite clear how you're going to do this, whether it's through synthetic fuels, hopefully, rather than biofuels taking land for agriculture and all the rest of it. But the the shift in the discourse from here in the UK, and I mean Switzerland are also doing it. Germany as well are kind of picking it up. NATO are going to have to do it themselves. They're also, but there's a real long way to go. Like, so the problem is that these militaries have been excluded from the climate change discourse for so long that they don't know what their emissions are. They don't have systems in place to track their emissions. They're way behind the kind of public sector here in the UK, or the private sector as well, who, you know, have had corporate social responsibility guidance in place for some years now, and many of them are way ahead of this, looking at scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 supply chain emissions in particular. Whereas the militaries are just like, you know, for all their sort of power, funding, resources, they're completely clueless on a lot of this stuff. They have no idea of how they institutionally will be able to reach this stage. And some of them, to be fair, you know, they're acknowledging that, but others, yeah, there's a very long way to go, with the likes of China, India, and Saudi, and some of these other big, yeah, countries with large military budgets. But there's a big shift, and things are changing quite quickly, and it's quite an interesting thing to follow.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, we have a question from Fatima. How can we as a youth present and work for these cases with our limited resources?
I think, yeah, probably the most practical way is addressing this issue with the visibility of the topic. And if you're, you know, if you're talking with your colleagues on environmental issues and engaging with them on the environment generally, then bring in some of this stuff around impact of conflicts. So for example, I'll, you know, go to UN Environment Assembly and do quite a lot of work around the UN Environment Assembly every year. And, you know, there are hundreds of NGO civil society representatives who are there, whether they're tracking marine plastics or agriculture and farmers or whatever else. But there's only a few of us who are actually talking about conflict. And certainly for a lot of countries, if they are suffering conflict or insecurity, then that's going to be impacting all the environmental issues they kind of work on. But until there's a higher level of awareness around this stuff, and it's about this mainstreaming, I suppose, that mainstreaming conflict and security issues in the environmental discourse, as well as the environment in the peace and security discourse. And so if you're engaging with your friends and colleagues, or just on your social media around environmental issues, then yeah, just be sure to flag some stuff around conflicts if you can, and just to help spread that awareness.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, there's something that I always, like in our own organization, we talked about, like, you know, when we take some of these issues, the physical, like, you know, much more visible issues like the marine waste and all of them as a predominant, but like the other things that have far reaching and long-term impacts, like, you know, we often even don't care about it. And that's why we really wanted to focus on this kind of conversation here. I have one final question, like in terms of how do you see that, like, you know, the NGOs, like in different parts of the world, are really mobilizing to put pressure on the local countries, you know, to address particularly this kind of impact, like, you know, the local environmental impact? And do you see that there are NGOs focusing on the legacy impact, like particularly with in Fallujah, like, you know, you had this huge long-term trails, like even until now people are suffering from like, you know, severe like maldevelopment in the bodies and all of these things. So do you see there are like really a good civil society being addressing these issues, or do you see that a complete lack of neglect both from the state and non-state actors in these conflict countries?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think when yeah, maybe like 10 years ago when we started out, there were very few NGOs, local civil society organizations, who were sort of working on these issues in these areas. And that's certainly not the case now. And I think, you know, people have a lot more access to social media, Facebook, Twitter, whatever else. There is a higher level of environmental awareness, particularly amongst younger people. I think a lot of people had kind of assumed that, you know, when there's a conflict on, the people, local people themselves don't care about the environment because they're just trying to survive. But actually, we often see that the environment becomes even more important for people. So, for example, we were in touch with a guy in Palestine, and we were chatting with him about this, and he was like, you know, as far as he's concerned, the people's connection to their environment and to the land is a really critical thing to them, particularly under occupation. You know, they have a sort of quite a profound connection to it, even more so. And that was also what we were seeing in Nagorno-Karabakh, that because this was a battle over territory, then people have that much more profound connection to it. So I guess, yeah, there's a lot more potential, I think, for supporting organizations, for working with them, and a lot more interest. To keep coming back to the example of Libya. So under Gaddafi, there were kind of 2 official state-sanctioned NGOs working on the environment, and that was kind of conservation stuff. After 2011, you had this huge expansion of civil society in Libya, even though the conflict was still ongoing. Within that, you had a lot of young environmental organizations as well who were working on a whole range of issues, from environmental education to chemical pollution along the coast to biodiversity. And these organizations were kind of set up, and they're going and they're using all the local tools. So I think there's a lot more potential to track and monitor these environmental issues and conflicts and to move this agenda forward. But there's the bottom up stuff which needs to be done, but there's also the top down side as well. So we were working with WWF around the COP15, the Biodiversity Convention, which was kind of happening this year and next year. And this is to develop a 10-year framework for global biodiversity protection. And for the first time, it's recognized that conflict is an indirect driver of biodiversity loss. But none of the environmental NGOs there are talking about it. None of the governments want to talk about conflict in the context of this Biodiversity Convention. And yet, for many countries who are affected by conflict and insecurity, they're not going to be able to implement this post-2030 biodiversity framework. Yemen's not going to be able to. Iraq's not going to be able to. Afghanistan's not going to be able to. They don't have the environmental governance capacity to be able to implement these agreements. And until we start talking about conflict in these spaces and addressing these issues, then yeah, we've still got a long way to go, I think.
Yeah, okay. I just thought I will just finish up with that one, but there was one question. I mean, you can respond to this, but before that, I'd like to highlight there was this very interesting work done by Arundhati Roy on, like, I really recommend you to read that one, The Common Good, and then the algebra of infinite injustice. And it's very interesting about, like, and she kind of briefly touches about how conflict creates that one. The question from Noha is that how can civil organizations in conflict areas help build data infrastructure? That would be the last question. Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess we use it quite a lot. We kind of engage people. So, for example, there was an oil spill off the coast of Libya a couple of weeks ago, and we connected quite a lot with a Libyan NGO who were doing work in that area. And there was stuff that we could bring. They didn't have satellite sort of capacity, but we could bring that and ended up. And that's the problem, we've got all this amazing satellite data we can use, but unless you can kind of verify what's happening on the ground, like, you're always looking down, but you're never quite sure, or can never be 100% on what you're seeing. So the key role for kind of local civil society, or whether we're just using social media posts and photos, is to kind of provide that ground truthing and ground verification, and also kind of environmental context as well. We're not living in these spaces. We don't know the environmental issues the same way that these local organizations do. So if we can bring our kind of knowledge and capacities together, it gives us a much stronger case. And I suppose the other way of doing this in a more formalized way, so citizen science, kind of participatory science, which has been a big thing over the last sort of 5-10 years. From example here in the UK is kind of school kids in London who are doing their own air quality monitoring, looking at air pollution from traffic. So we've been looking at kind of civilian science of what could you do to help support communities and organizations affected by conflict, to provide them with low-cost, simple techniques to monitor their environment, build up the data, build up the arguments, build up their knowledge, and give them more agency and capacity to challenge their local authorities and national authorities around the environmental issues they face. So yeah, there's many ways that we could potentially do this and do it more than we're doing at the moment, I think.
Okay, interestingly, Noha is from Libya, and she was asking because, like, she wants to support it from her local community. I hope, like, the citizen science, like, getting data, monitoring, hope, like, you could manage to find some institutions or universities could test, like, the soil samples and all those things could be an initial way to move forward from civil society. And also I'm going to do, on behalf of Doug, the advertisement for their organization. They have fantastic work, and they publish a lot of reports and case studies. I strongly recommend to follow their website, and I guess also the social media if you're active there. And also the report, if anyone is interested about military missions, like, keep an eye on the reports that they I hope like they're going to publish annual reports and along with some other programs as well. Thank you, Doug. I really appreciate and I commend all the work that you do. And I hope like, you get more greater recognition in the coming days. And I hope like to invite you to Doha as well in one of the conferences that we are planning to organize next year. And thank you so very much again. And thank you everyone for taking your time on this lovely weather. I really appreciate your commitment. Thank you everyone. Do take care and stay safe. Have a lovely day.
Thanks, Zaid. Thanks everyone.
Thank you.